I've always heard people say that you can never truly go back home. I didn't know how right they were until I tried. There's something about leaving a place for a long time that alters your perception of it. Stretches it out like an old sweater, changing the very shape of what you thought you knew. As I drove the familiar highway that wound through flat stretches of farmland, past the little towns that, the middle of America, I had plenty of time to think about the moment I'd been dreading for weeks, coming back home for the first time in 5 years. The trees along the road were thinner than I remembered. Some of the small businesses I'd seen growing up had been replaced by shiny new buildings or boarded-up windows. Even the billboards felt different, brighter, louder. The scenery was familiar, but not in a comforting way. It was as if I was watching a memory from far away, unable to touch it. My mind was filled with the past, but my present self didn't fit into it anymore. I left home at 23, full of the kind of dreams you carry when you've lived your entire life in a small town. I had wanted everything the world could offer beyond the borders of the place I had called home, and I went out in search of it. I lived in big cities, tasted new cultures, and wore my independence like armor. I thrived in that space between adventure and anonymity. For years, I didn't think much about my family back home. I always thought I'd have time to reconnect later, that our ties would hold strong no matter how much distance stretched between us. But time has a way of unraveling those invisible threads. Now, at 28, with life finally slowing down, I was coming back. Not out of desire but obligation. My mother had called 3 weeks ago, her voice a little shakier than I remembered, asking me to come for dinner. It was supposed to be a celebration, a homecoming as she put it. My parents and siblings would be there, just like old times. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I no longer belonged. I pulled off the highway, rolling into the outskirts of the town where I had grown up. Everything looked smaller. The streets that once felt endless and full of possibility now seemed narrow, suffocating even. I caught sight of the old high school where I spent 4 years navigating the awkwardness of adolescence. The building hadn't changed, but I had. The driveway to my parents' house was the same cracked cement that I remembered, but the house itself seemed smaller, older. I felt a sudden rush of apprehension. What was I walking into? What had changed inside these walls? As I stepped out of the car, the cool autumn air nipped at my skin, and I realized how distant I had become from this world. The front door loomed in front of me like a portal to a different time. I rang the doorbell, a gesture that felt odd given that it had once been my own front door. After what felt like an eternity, my mother answered. She smiled a little too broadly, I thought, and wrapped me in a hug that felt rehearsed, like something she'd been practicing in her head for days. Her arms were thinner than I remembered, and I noticed the faint wrinkles at the edges of her eyes. Come on in, she said, her voice light and slightly strained. Inside, everything looked the same but somehow different. The furniture was the same but rearranged. The smell of cooking filled the house, but it didn't carry the same warmth it once did. I stood awkwardly in the living room, trying to make small talk as my mother fluttered around, nervously preparing the final touches for dinner. My father appeared from the hallway, slower than I remembered, with grayer hair and a posture that seemed a bit more stooped. His smile was familiar, but there was something distant in his eyes, as though he was looking at a version of me that didn't exist anymore. We exchanged pleasantries, but it felt like we were both holding back, unsure how to bridge the gap between who we had been to each other and who we were now. My younger siblings arrived shortly after. They were older, of course, more mature, but I noticed how the energy between them hadn't shifted much. They still had that ease around each other, the kind of closeness that comes from shared lives. I was the outsider now, the one who had left and missed out on the small moments that knit them together. As we all sat around the dining room table, I couldn't help but feel like I was intruding on something sacred, a rhythm that I no longer knew how to follow. My brother talked about his new job at a local company, my sister about her recent engagement, and my parents chimed in with updates about old neighbors and distant relatives. I tried to participate, to engage, but the more I spoke, the more I realized how foreign my own life had become to them. The dinner conversation flowed around me like a current, but I felt as if I was standing on the edge of the stream, watching it pass by. I caught glimpses of the life I once knew, the jokes, the shared stories, the laughter, but I wasn't part of it anymore. I had been away for too long. Every word I said felt like a misplaced puzzle piece, too small to fit into the picture they had without me. It wasn't that they were unkind or unwelcoming. In fact, They were the opposite, too eager to include me in their conversations. Too enthusiastic about my return. But there was an invisible wall between us. Built not out of anger or resentment, but out of time and space. They had grown into people I no longer knew. And I had become someone they couldn't quite recognize. As the evening wore on, I found myself sinking deeper into my own thoughts. Disconnected from the chatter around me. My mother asked me questions about my life in the city. How was my job? Was I dating anyone? Did I think I'd ever move back? I gave polite, superficial answers, not wanting to admit how much I had distanced myself from everything they held dear. I had created a life so far removed from this one. A life that didn't have room for family dinners and small-town routines. At one point, I excused myself from the table and stepped outside onto the back porch. The night was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I stared up at the stars. The same stars I used to gaze at as a teenager. Dreaming of the places I would go and the things I would do. I had done those things. I had gone to those places. But standing there, surrounded by the echoes of my past, I realized how much I had lost along the way. The days after the dinner were marked by a series of awkward exchanges and forced interactions. I stayed with my parents for a few more days, hoping that the strange disconnection I felt would start to fade, that I would settle back into the familiar patterns of home. But it didn't happen. The small moments that used to bring comfort now felt alien. Sitting in the kitchen with my mother while she made breakfast. The silence between us stretched thin. We used to talk about everything when I was younger: school, friends, my future. Now, we struggled to find common ground. She asked me about my plans, and I gave vague answers, not wanting to admit that I didn't really have any. I had spent so much time chasing after a life that I hadn't stopped to figure out what I actually wanted. My father and I barely spoke beyond polite greetings. I think we both felt the weight of years spent apart. The conversations we should have had but didn't. He had always been the strong, silent type. But now that silence felt heavy. Almost oppressive. I knew he wanted to ask me about my life. About why I had stayed away for so long. But he never did. And I didn't offer any explanations. Even my siblings, who had always been my closest friends, felt distant. They had built lives that no longer included me. And I couldn't blame them. They had stayed. They had grown together, while I had left and grown apart. It wasn't until the last night of my visit that I finally understood why I felt like a stranger at that family dinner. It wasn't just that I had been away for years, or that we had all changed in our own ways. It was that I had been running from my family, from my past, from the person I used to be. I had spent so much time trying to prove that I didn't need them, that I could create a life on my own, that I hadn't realized how much I had isolated myself. I had distanced myself not just physically, but emotionally. And now, standing in the same house where I had grown up, surrounded by the people who had once known me better than anyone else, I felt more alone than I ever had before. It wasn't their fault. They had tried to welcome me back, to make me feel like I still belonged. But the truth was, I had changed too much. The person I had become didn't fit into the life I had left behind. And I didn't know how to reconcile the two. As I packed my bags the next morning and said my goodbyes, I felt a deep sense of sadness, but also a strange sense of closure. I knew I couldn't go back to the way things had been. But maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time to accept that I had outgrown this place, that my life was meant to be lived elsewhere. I hugged my parents, promised to keep in touch. And as I drove away from the house, I realized that while I may never feel fully at home in that world again, it would always be a part of me. And maybe that was enough. As the miles stretched between me and the town I used to call home, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't have all the answers. But I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't keep running. I had to find a way to reconcile the different parts of myself, the person I was, the person I had become, and the person I wanted to be. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be more moments of feeling like a stranger, of not quite fitting in. But I was ready to face those moments head on, instead of running from them. Because sometimes, the hardest part of coming home is realizing that you've changed too much to stay. And that's okay.